Good evening, everyone. And thank you, Mayor Schultz, for that wonderful framing of this topic. It is great to be back in Hamburg. I'm honored that you asked me to speak about the impact of digital information and the media has on election campaigns, especially in light of the turbulent results of the U.S. presidential campaign. I'm going to give you something of a first-hand account, and I'm going to broaden this out to give you some geopolitical context as well. But I think it's fitting that this event takes place in Hamburg, which, as you all know, has a rich history in promoting a free press to strengthen democracy. Only a lifetime ago, in the mid-1940s, Hamburg became Germany's most important hub for new and democratic media. Thanks to the willingness of the British occupation force, people like Gerd Bucerius, Rudolf Augstein, and Axel Springer were able to establish some of the most important newspapers and editorial houses in German history. Gerd Bucerius, the political and journalistic icon of the city, took refuge in the United Kingdom and established the weekly paper that became synonymous with the newfound German liberalism. Equally influential, Rudolf Augstein, recognized in 2000 by the International Press Institute as one of the 50 world press freedom heroes, established Der Spiegel, together with British Army officer John Seymour Challoner. The paper to this day sets journalistic standards here and abroad. Axel Springer founded his publishing company here in Hamburg in 1946, published the still existing Hamburger Abendblatt, as well as a popular radio and TV programs. You know the rest of the story. I raise these points because I want to make the point that the Brits trusted anti-fascist Germans, who in turn trusted their readers to become part of a project of the re-democratization of Germany, the public exchange of opinions and trust in the public sphere. All of them were as important to reintroducing Germany into the family of nations as was the Marshall Plan. This is an incredibly important reminder what freedom of opinion can help achieve. It's also a warning of what might happen if trust in journalism and the public sphere are undermined. Liberal democracy was rebuilt in Germany from Hamburg and other cities, and this amazing city continues its proud tradition, has become a major national and international hub of media and technology. From a U.S. perspective, this makes Hamburg a special part of the North Atlantic community. During the 8 years of the Obama administration, the United States and Germany were steadfast partners in tackling the world's greatest challenges, from confronting terrorism to freezing the Iran nuclear program to the successful conclusion of the Paris Climate Agreement, which I was proud to have helped shape. This close partnership is perhaps best seen in the friendship between President Obama and Chancellor Merkel. The final call that President Obama made as Commander-in-Chief was to the Chancellor, and he's scheduled to meet her again in Berlin this month. So it is in this collaborative spirit that I'm here to discuss the challenges both our political systems face. And I hope that what I learned from the 2016 election will help guide the political and policy decisions that you'll have to make in the coming months as your own national elections approach. As I noted, when Hamburg was maturing into the city it is today, crucial alliances formed between America and Europe based on shared values. Regardless of political ideology, the United States and presidents of both parties have maintained a faithful commitment to NATO and the fundamental concept of democratic governance. But the paradigm of global stability and democratic order that has flourished in Europe and in the United States is not immune to political threats. It must be defended and strengthened. Our recent presidential election, in my view, makes that crystal clear. It alerted us to the notion that in the 21st century, a new geopolitical challenge has arisen. Democratic nations face a new threat: the unprecedented weaponization of digital information. To be sure, Secretary Clinton was not a perfect candidate, and I am sure our campaign, which I chaired, made mistakes large and small. It was our job to win, and we failed to do that. The fact that we let Donald Trump have the keys to the White House and the codes to the nuclear football, to me and my colleagues, is soul-crushing and a heavy burden to everyone who has had a leadership role in our campaign. But it is also clear, beyond doubt now, that the Russian government interfered in the U.S. election. In the heat of the campaign, that was harder to prove. For almost a year, there was a toxic combination of hacking, the public release of stolen information, and a deluge of misinformation and fake news in our media. The overall Russian strategy to interfere in our election did not, to the best of our knowledge, involve tampering with the actual voting machinery. Instead, Russian agents took active measures to relentlessly pursue a two-pronged approach to first extract and publicize politically sensitive information through online hacking, and then to weaponize an avalanche of false news stories through social media to spread public discord. The Russian probe into our electoral system began with a series of hacks into the Democratic Party institutions, followed by a targeted hack of individual email accounts that belonged to officials close to Hillary Clinton's campaign. A few months before the election, it was discovered that Russian state-backed hackers had accessed the computer network of the Democratic National Committee, the Democratic Party's main organizing and fundraising entity. The hackers saw the content of emails and all the opposition research against Republican presidential candidates that Democrats had generated to prepare for the general election. Then, working with WikiLeaks, the hackers publicly released much of that politically sensitive information. They repeated this pattern of gaining access to sensitive political information and making it public with respect to individual email accounts as well. As the chairman of Secretary Clinton's campaign, I became the target of that approach. In October, just a month before our election, when any single piece of news could sway the final results, WikiLeaks released the first batch of what were 60,000 emails that Russian hackers had stolen from my account. They were private exchanges with campaign staff, donors, my friends and family, all made public. And of course, when journalists and certainly our Republican opponents found out about the information, most of the content, which was actually rather boring, was taken out of context to seem more sensational than it actually was. That was part of what I called the first prong of their approach. Russian hackers extracted sensitive political information that was publicly released through their own outlets like Guccifer 2.0 and in collaboration with Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. U.S. intelligence reports found that in total, Russian hackers accessed the email accounts of more than 100 Democratic Party officials and organizations. Intelligence sources have confirmed they also hacked Republican accounts, but the public release of the information and the ensuing damage was directed only at one party. The second prong of their strategy was really a partisan misinformation campaign that weaponized fake news stories to slander Secretary Clinton and tilt the election in favor of Donald Trump. This element of the digital strategy involved an army of Russian trolls and bots. These bots are false Twitter and Facebook accounts, as the mayor was noting, that are programmed to provide an endless supply of false news stories and overwhelm other users to the point where they can shift voters' attitudes to favor one candidate over another. In the midst of the election, the Russian bots co-opted narratives and political arguments from the most extreme, fringe, right-wing voices in American politics and spread them to such an extent that absurd stories and deeply disturbing perspectives became mainstream through the repetition through social media. For instance, many in this fringe group believed that Hillary Clinton was seriously ill during the campaign, and the bots spread that blatant lie to millions of American voters who may or may not have let that impact their voting decision. It became difficult to differentiate between reality and digital fiction, and even after the election, phrases like post-truth and alternative facts, as the mayor noted, have become commonplace, even amongst the president's most senior advisors. The election felt quite frankly, like a hall of mirrors rather than the sober democratic process it is supposed to be. All of this cast a dark cloud over the integrity of our election and tampered with the judgment of our voters. The backbone of a healthy democracy is a well-informed public, one that can be trusted to elect its leaders based on reliable information and sound judgment. The binding element that makes this possible and connects voters with information and analysis is the media. Over the last decade, the media landscape evolved from traditional print and TV sources to digital platforms and social media. I think when compared side by side, Germany's traditional state-sponsored media landscape with its commitment to quality journalism may seem less dramatic or sensational than many American media outlets. But what makes digital media so powerful is that it actually crosses these global boundaries. Instead of receiving their news from a few professional, trusted, and well-known media outlets, people now consume much of their news from news feeds that are curated to reinforce the reader's or viewer's preferences and have a dangerous tendency to elevate the sensational over the informative. It's a self-reinforcing and dangerous cycle. Digital platforms generate sensational material and stoke the modern appetite for drama, further blurring the line between fact and fiction. During the 2016 election, we saw the political news cycle swing from one salacious story to the next, rather than focus on the substantive issues that would actually make a difference in people's lives and that should help guide their votes. The theatrics were a dangerous diversion from the larger enterprise of democracy and a threat to people's capacity to reason and parse through this flood of information. In this tumultuous media landscape, Russian operatives found fertile ground to take active measures and sow discord within our electorate, including by deploying misinformation, as I noted. So what started as a Russian effort to undermine public faith in the integrity of the electoral process shifted to a campaign to damage and weaken a strong leader capable of standing up to Russian provocations. And it finally culminated, according to U.S. intelligence community, in its assessment that it made in January, in President Putin and the Russian government aspiring to help President-elect Trump's election chances. Of course, you and especially your colleagues in the Bundestag are already familiar with Russian cyber strategies to play havoc with respect to their hack of the German state computer system over a 3-week period in the spring of 2015. Since then, the distinctly Russian strategy to use digital tools to undermine national politics has evolved to impact domestic elections throughout Europe and to steer geopolitics in its favor. Just last week, we saw new reports that Russia's state-based actors were attacking the computers and accounts of the campaign of Emmanuel Macron. They are apparently deploying the same tactic to spread misinformation through state-sponsored channels like Sputnik and RT, and fake news articles through their web of social media communications to damage Macron, a globally minded pro-EU candidate, and try to tip the scale in favor of Marine Le Pen, a vocally anti-EU candidate. In the UK, party officials have increasingly suggested that Russian propaganda apparatus, complete with its army of online bots and supply of false news stories, promoted a vote for Brexit. In each of these cases, we see that Russia's measures are targeted to achieve political results that weaken the European Union, the transatlantic alliance, and the integrity of national governments. Russian interference in these cases is particularly dangerous, in my view, because unlike traditional cyber intelligence efforts that many countries are actively engaged in, Russia's digital strategy deliberately manipulates information to sway public opinion. It is effectively engaged in a kind of information warfare that is harming the fabric of democracy in the U.S. and across the Atlantic. By interfering in our democratic processes, President Putin can encourage voters to doubt the integrity of elections, a dangerous prospect that can undermine the legitimacy of government and force countries to focus more on internal affairs and bolster their domestic legitimacy. This shift in attention, I think, can distract countries like the US and Germany from being able to respond effectively to global threats, including Russia's agenda to aggressively and hostilely operate against its neighbors. So we must stay vigilant about the threat that Russia poses, not just in our elections, but to the larger project of democratic Western alliance that has safeguarded our nations for the past half-century. This, of course, is not an insurmountable challenge, but we need to be clear about the path forward. Russia, of course, is not the only country that will take advantage of cyber vulnerabilities that have become apparent in the latest round of democratic elections across the globe, and Russia itself won't stop attacking our political system, particularly given the success of deploying low-cost and highly effective digital cyber attacks. So the underlying question and central task, I think, before us then is what is our transatlantic strategy to adapt and reinforce our democracies in the digital age? The internet, of course, is a remarkably democratic instrument. Information is now more easily accessible and in greater quantities than ever before, no matter where you live or what your economic status is. This can be a force for good, and it has been in the past as we've seen younger generations use digital platforms to launch movements for freedom, for human rights, and for equality. In the United States, we've seen increased civic engagement enabled by the same digital platforms. To name just a couple of standout examples, right after the inauguration, more than 500,000 people participated in the Women's March in Washington, D.C., and hundreds of thousands around the country to defend women's rights and those marches took place throughout the world. A couple of weeks ago, more than 40,000 people participated in the March for Science to oppose the Trump administration's anti-science agenda, to try to get back to reason and science that the mayor talked about. Just this last weekend, more than 200,000 people came to Washington, D.C. for the People's Climate March to keep up the pressure on policymakers to act on climate. This is a product of remarkable reach of digital organizing, civic involvement that makes a real impact. But after the marches fade, this conversation about democracy must be sustained, where different views are put forth for people to consider and explore and debate. When people retreat from the public arenas and go back home to their computers, their social media accounts all too often turn into isolating echo chambers. Social media algorithms push information to users in a way that, as President Obama cautioned in his farewell address, we become so secure in our bubbles that we start accepting only information, whether it's true or not, that fits our opinion, instead of basing our opinion on the evidence that is out there. That's how misinformation becomes contagious. Small or false stories can start from one corner of the country, from someone with no credibility, and because of the amplifying effect of social media, spread throughout the country and even get elevated to a national story that can change the course of history. Studies have shown that on social media sites, people tend to engage with information and articles that align with their own points of view. That's, of course, part of human nature. People gravitate towards what's comfortable and what reinforces rather than challenges their views. But the algorithms underpinning Facebook's newsfeed, for instance, then interpret this kind of one-sided engagement as a demand and supply the user with even more information that lines up with that perspective. In this digital world, everyone exists in their own reality with no single objective source of cross-cutting information. That's dangerous because collective reason is stifled when people remain in comfortable information ecosystems. A vibrant conversation about democracy involves listening to each other, understanding opposing points of view, and reaching a collective decision about what policies and which elected officials would be best for the nations. Studies indicate that a majority of online users worldwide receive their news now through social media, and that's growing. In 2015, the number of social media users increased by more than 200 million people. With access to the right information, you can figure out not just what someone's gender, race, or political affiliation is, but you can understand parts of them that they might not even be aware of, like what kind of ads draw their attention, or what kind of fake news stories they're likely to click on and share with their friends. If that technology is being used to sell running shoes or market cute animal pictures, it all seems kind of benign. But in the political context, they have sometimes have contradictory effects. They've contributed to greater democratic participation, as I've noted, but it's also overwhelmed traditional checks on political extremism. So let me leave you with two questions I think that are vital to our democracy. First, how do we retool the internet and digital platforms to be safe public fora? And second, can we maximize the chances that digital communications will strengthen our democratic systems rather than undermine them? With respect to public safety and personal privacy, the advent of big data is a challenge for us to reconsider how we protect not just people's privacy, but broader values, such as the balance of power between certain entities, whether the government or private corporations, when they have access to sensitive information that online users may or may not even know exists. As counselor to President Obama, I led a review of how big data is affecting our lives and how the government can best adjust its policies and norms to keep people safe. After that review was conducted, we made several policy recommendations to legislators to strengthen privacy protections for individuals, including non-U.S. persons. That was a topic particularly sensitive here in Germany, to protect those in U.S. government-based systems, to ensure data collected in schools is used only for educational purposes, and to expose the potential for automated, algorithm-driven decision-making to discriminate against protected classes like race or religion. Unfortunately, Trump's administration seems to be going backwards in protecting people in the cyber context. Within a few months of entering office, the administration repealed internet privacy regulations that the Obama administration had put in place at the end of the term to allow users greater autonomy over how companies can use search histories and other personal online data. Getting cyber policy right is crucial if we think about it in terms of safeguarding the public commons. Just as people gather in public squares and parks and expect a level of security and civility, everyone should feel just as comfortable interacting in cyberspace. The new frontier in thinking about cyber policy is how to tailor regulations and public policy to apply to cyberspace as new dimension of public engagement that is subject to the same level of public scrutiny and safety as non-cyberspace interaction. That brings me to my second question about the way forward. How do we think about digital engagement as a strength and not a liability in our countries? In a well-functioning democracy, people should be able to interact digitally to strengthen civic engagement and therefore our political system. But the insidious risk that digital interaction poses to our democracies is that cyberspace is a boundless and porous entity. Anyone could say anything to anyone else, whether it's true or false, with little accountability or general standards of conduct. We're still, I think, in the initial phase of grappling with a response to that reality. The norms and traditions in the United States and Germany are leading to two different approaches. In the U.S., our strong First Amendment protections have guided policymakers who are loath to suggest solutions that can be characterized as regulating speech. For example, in that same farewell speech of President Obama's that I mentioned, he argued for vigilance, not regulation, when he noted, so just as we citizens must remain vigilant against external aggression, we must guard against a weakening of the values who make us who we are. In Germany, which has been scarred by the cataclysmic results of hate speech taken to its most extreme ends, policymakers weigh the balance differently and have proposed that not only the person inciting hate, but the platform on which the hate speech is disseminated should be punished. The truth is that with the exponential rate of technological change, that change may outstrip political leaders in our respective countries from formulating an effective answer. I think that places a special burden on private sector actors to build tools to ensure that open, fact-based dialogue will continue. Social media platforms should find ways guard against hyping discernible lies at the expense of credible sources. I guess that's what Mark Zuckerberg's exploring in his missive on building a global community. But I think they have a special burden to show that what their algorithms and platforms are doing are trying to elevate facts and not lies. Ordinary citizens, I think, have a responsibility too. They must think more carefully about the veracity of the information they consume, and people must be wary of any effort, particularly from political leaders, starting with Presidents Trump and Putin, to disorient and discredit reliable information. Of course, a heavy burden falls on journalists to fact-check political leaders like our president and a White House staff that are setting records for peddling false information, and they must not be afraid to call a lie a lie. Like Hamburg many decades ago, the world's entering a new information age. Everyday people will have access to large volumes of information from different sides of the political spectrum. That will invariably affect their judgment and personal and political behavior. It's our responsibility to safeguard democratic institutions and norms as we enter this new age of history. Thank you.